Okay, welcome to the 92nd episode of an Evolving Man podcast. Today I'm delighted to be speaking to Charles Spencer. Charles is an author, a broadcaster, a podcaster, a British peer, and the younger brother of the late Diana, Princess of Wales. He has recently published a memoir about his time at boarding school called A Very Private School. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. I'd love for you to begin the podcast, just for you to share a little bit what drew you to writing your book and why now?
Well, I didn't plan to write a book, but actually I've written quite a few and I never really planned them. They creep up on me. And this one was particularly a bit of a sleeper that then tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You need to write me." So I've been in therapy for decades, and a lot of the times the therapy went back to my boarding school years, and particularly in the last 17 years or so, after I was told by a very respected therapist that my problems definitely did stem from my years at Maidwell Hall in the 70s. And I started a file on my computer, just jotting down memories of the place. And then I started to meet people who were at Maidwell with me back in the day. And some of them had such terrible stories that they shared with me, stories they hadn't shared with anyone before. And one of them told me of his being raped 3 times at the age of 9 and all sorts of horrors beyond that. And I said to him, he's a very sweet, quiet, gentle fellow. And I said, I just can't write this. It's too much. And he grabbed me by the arm and became very animated for the first time in our conversation. And he said, "Someone has to write this, and it has to be you," because I'm a writer, I guess. And so I thought about that. And then very soon after that, I bumped into somebody else who was at the school whose brother had died as a direct result, his family felt, of having been neglected so badly and abused as well at Maidwell. And I thought, you know what? I think this has to be shared with the world.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I found it very powerful reading your book because there's so many examples of like your friend that who was raped when he was 9, but all those dozens. And I was reading on, I think Saturday, and I was in tears hearing the communication between parents and the boys and how they weren't listened to. And that really,
Yes. I think these schools, I mean, it's hard to blame parents as such, although clearly they're the ones who knew what was happening to their, in this case, sons, and didn't do anything about it. I obviously have to take some blame. But the headmaster, Mr. Porch, was very good at charming parents. He was the least charming man I've ever met. But to see him in action with the parents he was brilliant at it, laughing and joking. And he constructed part of his abusive smokescreen was to compose very funny, darkly funny reports at the end of each term. And I spoke to many of the parents when I said, "Look, you do realize this was an appalling place."
mm,
And even now, 50 years on, some of the parents said, "But he did write such jolly amusing reports." And of course, it was very clever because I think the parents thought, "Look, our boys must just be wrong because this man is really fun. And it's a pity our boys don't really get how wonderful he is." But the man we saw every day in, day out, was really a monster.
thank you. Thank you. I'm going to remember, I think in the book you talk about Mr. Maud as well, and how your father said something like, "Oh, isn't he a pleasant chap?" And
Yes.
something along the lines of, "Are you sure you're talking about the same person?"
Yes, I thought that. I didn't even say it. It's quite interesting if you look back. I mean, a lot of my contemporaries agree. We didn't really have very meaningful conversations with our parents. It wasn't really expected or done in our social set in the 1970s. One of my contemporaries marked down as the weirdest thing about his first day at boarding school at Maidwell was the fact that his father had a conversation with him because he couldn't remember having had one before in the car on the way to school. And Mr. Maud was a horrifying figure. I mean, every day since the book's come out, I've heard from more people who are at that school, not even at the same time as me, and they all say, yes, it's exactly, that's how it was, but they all comment on Mr. Maud's absolutely terrifying role in their lives when they were little boys. He was a proper sadist. He was a sexual pervert too, but a sadist of note. There is an episode I report in the book about one of his roles was being in charge of swimming, and he made a boy who he knew couldn't swim, who was protesting that he couldn't swim, attempt to swim the long length that Maidwell's very large pool had. And as he got into trouble, he kept trying to come to the side of the pool. And Mr. Maud hit his hand so he couldn't get a grip of the side of the pool for safety. And he eventually passed out and sank to the bottom and was rescued, and the whole thing was covered up. But Mr. Maud every day was when you saw him coming towards you, your stomach shrank in fear. He was a very, very frightening figure.
Thank you, Charles. And in your book at the beginning, you ask a question of one of your contemporaries, if you could sum up the school in one word. So I'd love to ask you that question. If you could sum up the school in one word, what would it be, Charles?
Well, my friend, when I put it to him, my contemporary rather than my friend, actually, he said fear. Definitely fear was part of it. I've always been quite obstinate, and I think mine would be rage. I knew, although I had no context, I knew it was wrong. And I knew that this was something that you were allowed to be outraged by. So I'm afraid I can't come up with anything more positive than rage. But it wasn't the rage of an adult. It was the rage of a child, an impotent child who knew that he had to protect himself. And I think rather like a puppy that's been badly treated can become a bit of a problem in the house or in society as a whole. I think it instilled in me a real resentment that we were being treated so appallingly, even though I didn't know you could be treated better because I hadn't got any context at all.
Thank you. Thank you. I remember at the beginning of the book, I think when you met up with your friends and you asked them, well, how do you remember me at school? And I think they said an angry
Yes.
boy. So
I didn't go into it in the book because who cares? But I tried to deal with this in a different way. There were two gangs. It was quite a weird school because it was very proper in many ways, but there was also, we had knives and we were made to fight each other by the masters every day and all sorts of quite weird stuff. But I couldn't fit into, there were two gangs you had to join, and I set up a third one because I didn't want to join either, and had all the misfits in my one, really. But it's interesting because I look at these, and I don't want to sound like John Bercow, the Speaker of the House, who clung proudly onto his doing well in dancing certificate when he wrote his autobiography. But I was actually, in terms of the school, reasonably successful. I wasn't the kid, I had my rugby colours. I was, senior prefect. I was one of the best at swimming or whatever. All soloist and the carols. So I wasn't one of those quiet children. But I remember being really angry on their behalf too. And in fact, a couple of the guys who were there with me have said that I was really, I had a sort of survivor's guilt because I had found a way of surviving, although it wasn't a happy way, it was an angry way. But I could see these very sensitive boys who had been destroyed, and it made me very cross.
Thank you. Thank you. Going back to the beginning of your story, you talk a little bit about being at home and then your sister going off to boarding school. How was that for you? You were very close to Diana. There's some lovely stories about Silwell where your first day at school, she comes to look at you to check you're okay. How was that for you when she went off to boarding school? How did that impact you?
Yes, well, I think I have early problems with boarding school that predate my going. The first was that I found out that my mother, one of the reasons she left home was because the logic in her brain at the time was that, oh, I was going to go to boarding school anyway, so what did it matter if she was at home or not? So that's a resentment I've had, because that gave her carte blanche to sort of disappear from quite a large chunk of my life. But then the other one was losing Diana. So when Diana was packed off, she went slightly older, because that was the custom in my family anyway. She went when she was 10 and I was 7. And that left me alone, because our other two, we had a brother who died as a baby. So there was a gap in the family. It was my 2 older sisters, who I'm very close to, but they're a lot older. And then the death of my brother John, and then Diana and me. So I really grew up with Diana. I mean, so I got to the age of 7, and suddenly she was gone. She'd gone to a boarding school, and life was very, very different. And obviously lonely. I always had lots of friends at school, but back at home it became very lonely. And I write about it, actually. Obviously a very privileged upbringing, but at that stage, you know, I wasn't considered old enough to eat with my father, and I'd be in our drawing room at home watching television in the evening by myself, with the butler bringing a tray for me to continue by myself. And so I did miss her a lot, because before that we were together the whole time.
Thank you, Charles. So one of the things you talk about at the beginning is this separation. I think page 9, you said what we suffered was not just a separation from all that we knew and loved, but an amputation. It lacked the most important quality of home. It was without love. I'd love you to talk us through those first few weeks at Maidwell Hall. How was it for you?
I remember bits of it, and I still have the letters home I wrote. So the first day was utterly bewildering, and I couldn't believe it was happening to me. It was like an out-of-body experience, saying goodbye to my pets and my family and my life, and getting in a car for 2.5 hours and then being deposited in the care of the matron. I think did this she was a horrible woman, Mrs. Ford. She selected for me, because my father was a very gentle, sweet man, which I hope comes across, but he asked if somebody could kindly keep an eye on me, because I'd never spent a night away from home by myself. And I was allotted this absolutely appalling, he turned out to be the school bully. The matron foisted him on me. And I remember this moment where my father had just left for home. The matron was otherwise engaged, and this boy, 12-year-old boy who was meant to be my guardian for a few days, just looked me up and down with sheer contempt and said, "You're on your own," and then left me to it. And I just remember the bewildering feeling of it was like being dumped in somebody else's life, and not knowing what was expected. There were lots of things we had to go through. We were given a number to identify us in the school. We lost our first names. I became just Spencer, my surname, and I became number 64 for the administration of the school. And yeah, it was very bleak. I was very lucky. The other new boys that I was in the same dormitory with were very, very nice, very shattered. I can see now, sort of shell-shocked by the same experience. But we were a very gentle, quiet little bunch, and kind to each other. And we were lucky. I didn't write about this in the book, but we had a very nice guy who was our dormitory prefect, and he didn't really join in our lives, but he would come in late after we were asleep and just sleep there in case there was an emergency in the night. And he was a kind person, which was not often the case. And then at the first term, and in fact, my first term there, I was in the bottom form, and that was run by a very sweet, very shy, rather nervous lady who the rest of the staff seemed to look down on, but she liked her 7 and 8-year-olds and was very kind to us. So yeah, it was the calm before the storm, but everywhere around you was a lot of fear, a lot of pain, a lot of corporal punishment, and it was pretty horrible, really, because there just didn't seem to be any nice members of staff, and it was a small school. I call it a very private school, because that is the truth of how they got away with such terrible abuse. was the headmaster keeping it very tight indeed. He essentially closed it down as a community that he dominated. And parents, I think literally, apart from the first day when you were left there and the parents came in with you, parents weren't allowed in the building at all, even on sports day, which was also Parents' Day. There were signs outside just saying you will not come in, and your son will be with you at a certain point. I had a godfather who I didn't know very well, and his son is a big deal name now, and he wrote to me last week and said how, as a 15-year-old, he and his father were passing Maidwell, and his father, who had no idea how abusive the place was, said, "Oh, let's drop in and see that nice Mr. Porch." And the headmaster just spent his entire time trying to get them away. He didn't want to be dropped in on. And also, actually, this famous man who wrote to me said how he just begged and begged in the weekly letter home to be taken out. And only after he left the school does his mother say to him, "We'd decided if you sent one more letter the next week in the same vein, we'd have taken you out, but you didn't." And he couldn't believe how close he got to getting out of that place. It was literally one more week of saying how awful it was, and he'd have been spared it for the rest of his time.
Wow. Wow. Amazing. I think there's one story of one boy who was taken out. I think you were out walking, and was it an American mother came in and took her son away or something like that?
Yeah, that was that. I recount that tale. It wasn't at Maidwell. It was an older friend of mine who was at a school, and the boys were being made to go on a walk with a bullying member of staff. And an American mother popped by to see her son, which she could rarely do because she was abroad a lot. And the master told her she wasn't allowed to see him. So, rather wonderfully, she went up, smashed him around the face with her slap, and took her son away. And they never saw her or the son again. He was liberated by his mother, who wasn't going to put up with this nonsense and not being able to see her son when she wanted to.
Wow. 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 Amazing. Yeah, I was always reflecting on that in my own boarding school, is that very few people managed to escape. Those that ran away were brought back. I think there was the only other two ways was either suicide or being expelled.
Yes, I found out again since writing the book last week. Somebody wrote to me and said they got as far as Market Harbour, which is a good effort. It's about 12 miles or so. And then they were hauled back and given a hell of a caning. So the headmaster had a fetish for canes, and he had one called the Swish, which was particularly hard and knobbly. And this boy got the Swish for getting away, but he became a hero because he had, got away from the school for a little bit.
Thank you. Could you talk a little bit, Charles, about the physical violence? You kind of talk about it a bit in the book, or quite a lot. I'd love you to talk a little bit how that was. So the first few weeks, you could see it happening. When did that start to happen to you, or did you become more aware of it?
Is this the corporal punishment?
The corporal punishment.
Yes. So pretty much your first term, you were not going to get beaten. You've got a certain number of lives for every offence. And new boys got 32 lives, which was, you had to really not be learning lessons if you did something 32 times. But we're talking about minor misdemeanors, really, such as spilling your water at lunch by mistake, or letting water, there was a lake there, and if you let water go over your Wellington boot by mistake, then that was you lost a life. But if you were a senior in the school, you only had to break any of those rules 3 times and you got beaten. Or if you were late coming out of the room, washing your hands before meals, that would be a life gone as well. I think the whole structure of the school was built around the headmaster's sadistic desire to inflict pain on small boys. And everyone was in on it, really. And if you wanted to be a popular member of staff with this very frightening man, you made sure you sent him victims, rather like feeding the Minotaur, I think. And the matron who I've mentioned, Granny Ford, who was really horrid, she curried favour with the headmaster by exceeding her duties on the upper floors of the school. She was really meant to be doing medicine, which she hadn't got a clue about, hygiene, laundry, that sort of thing, and the food in the dining room. But she took it on herself to be almost a pair of eyes to catch boys and send them to the headmaster. And any boy who got sent by a member of staff was going to get really, really done. If you were taken by a prefect or whatever, then you were going to get one level of corporal punishment, usually the slipper, done very, very hard, but through trousers. But, you know, frequently, several times a week, many times a week, boys would be caned. And the caning was, I still remember, you know, we used to have showers together in the afternoons after games. The unbelievable marks on boys' buttocks where there was bloody strips of, you know, where their skin was broken by the cane. And sometimes he would do 5 strokes parallel and then put the 6 across the 5. And the pain, you know, there was one thing more painful, very strangely, and actually somebody wrote to me today about it, and I experienced this. When you were caught at night talking by him, he'd patrol at night, the headmaster, try and catch you whispering. And he hit us as hard as he could with his slipper. And that, through, you know, a cotton pair of pajamas, was more painful than the cane, weirdly. It was just so startlingly painful. He was a very wiry, fit man of probably around 50, and he really knew how to hurt. And, you know, every day at 10 to 6 after supper, a gaggle of boys would be sent down the corridor to his private wing and would be lined up against a wall by the deputy head boy and then sent in to meet the headmaster, who would be sitting there and would listen to your misdemeanor with the head boy behind him marking down on a notebook what you were accused of and what punishment you got. It was all very ritualized and dark. The journey down that corridor after tea was unbelievably scary. One boy who was slightly younger than me, who hadn't been beaten much, was so scared waiting that he lost control of his bladder and bowels. And the headmaster came storming out of his study to say, "What on earth have you done, you filthy little boy?" and sent him away. But the proof of my theory that he needed boys to beat is shown in what happened next. He turned on another boy who had done nothing wrong. He was only there as a witness to somebody's misdemeanor, and beat him in the boy's place who had fouled himself. And, you know, it's just monstrous, really. You weren't learning from any mistakes. I actually don't believe in corporal punishment at all, never have. But, you know, if there was a point to corporal punishment, dark though that may be, that there was no logic to it at Maidwell. It was just there for the headmaster's fun.
Yeah, just really shocking. I was reading Roald Dahl's book this morning.
Oh yes, boy. Yes, brilliant.
Well, it's actually the biography. I can't remember the name of the writer, and it's more recent, a couple of years ago. And I think he has letters and things like that, and he talks about how Roald Dahl was beaten by the senior prefects. And yeah, that's one of the things I do is I read a lot of autobiographies, and so many
Yes.
talk about this. Tony Blair was caned at Fetis, same for David Cameron, Richard Branson, on a weekly basis, and I'm just always shocked when I read another story. So thank you for having the courage to share it.
Thank you.
So I think another thing you mentioned in there is like about how he kept this system intact. So he kept the parents out, but you know, you mentioned about concealment, collusion, and cunning. I mean,
Yes.
the other staff members, did any of them speak up, or were they somehow involved in this?
Well, it's interesting. So to cut the other members of staff some slack, there was no culture of whistleblowing in mid-70s England. And I imagine some of the very junior members of staff felt they'd never be employed again if they did blow the whistle, if they had felt inclined to. I spoke to there are 3 members of staff still alive from this time. And the youngest of those is now a retired figure. And I went to see him, and I hadn't let him know what I was writing, because I hadn't crossed my mind. I wasn't tricking him either. I just wanted to know his memories of the school. And he was full of the joys of the place and how marvelous it was. And I went, well, not really. And then he got more honest, and not, I'm sorry, then he got more direct. He wasn't being deliberately dishonest. And then he said he was the junior master as a bachelor, probably 22 or so when he started there. And he said, yeah, he did notice going past the long line of boys waiting to be beaten every evening, because he had his apartment in the same wing as where we were punished. And then he married a female member of staff, an assistant matron, who said that she was only 18, 19 or 20 or something. She couldn't believe how frequent bedwetting was among the boys, which she conceded was probably a sign of trauma. And there were several masters who were in on it with him. So the headmaster was at the apex of this brutal society. Mr. Maud, who we touched on earlier, was a very willing second to the brutality, and was even more frightening because he was so out of control when he was hurting us, throwing boys across the room, knocking one out with a window pole, going up behind a great friend of mine who emigrated actually on the basis of Maidwell, because he thought if that's the essence of Englishness, he didn't want to be part of it and have his children as part of it. Went up behind him and hit him in the back of the head, so he passed clean out, unconscious. Really frightening, you know. And obviously, and then there was another one who is alive, and I've had to change his name, so we call him Mr. Goff, who was genuinely scary to me. He didn't like me and everything I represented. I realize now. I knew he didn't like me, but I used to have bright red hair and quite a lot of it. And he used to, very cleverly, he used to hit me in the head, and at the last moment roll his hand over. So he had a signet ring, and it used to just gouge me in the scalp and cut me open. Wow. But it was thin cuts, and the blood used to congeal in the base of my hair, and nobody ever saw it. Now, I know from my reports that the headmaster knew that this man didn't like me, because he actually recorded that. But the point is, no one was going to help, because the headmaster couldn't blow the whistle on somebody being a sadist, because they would blow it back, I imagine. And then you had other members of staff who, well, you touched on it, they were complicit. And then there were people who wanted to be mute, didn't want to get involved. And I think there was such toxicity at Maidwell when I was there that it's fascinating. It did impinge into decent humans as well, decent masters. It's quite clear to me from talking to people who were there a long time before me that Mr. Porch, the headmaster, was considered quite a benevolent being before he became headmaster. And then he stepped into this terrible role of inflicting pain. Equally, Mrs. Ford was the junior matron to start with, and everyone thought she was wonderful because she wasn't as bad as the senior one. But when the senior one moved on, she quickly became as bad as the one she replaced. So there was something rotten in the culture that made these people sink to their lowest possible moral form.
Wow. Yeah, I was really shocked by so many of the stories about knocking a child out. I couldn't believe one story about a boy who's knocked out. He wakes up and he's crying, and then he's told off for crying. But they don't tell him, you know, they don't tell the parents it's because he was knocked unconscious by a teacher.
Yes, his mother was cross with him because the school complained that he had cried. And he tried to explain, but she didn't want to hear it. She thought he had let the side down by being a sort of crybaby, when in fact he had literally been knocked unconscious.
Jeez. Yeah, wow. Yeah, I felt quite a bit of anger reading some of these stories.
It's been very interesting, Piers, listening to people. I had some of them around here the other day. They're in the book, particularly badly abused. One who was, I call him Perry Pelum. I've changed all the boys' names. And he's a lovely, lovely guy, very sweet, very quiet, very bright, but he wasn't good at math. And the headmaster said to him before a math test, he wanted to beat him and he couldn't beat him because he was well behaved, etc. he said, I just want you to know that every percent you drop in this maths paper, you're going to get a stroke of my cane. And Perry just froze, and he got 44%. And then he was summoned to the attics when in a part of the school where no one went by the headmaster. And he said, look, you can't expect me to beat you 56 times. And Perry said, well, thank you, sir, sort of thing. And he went, well, what's 7 into 56? And Perry said, well, that's 8, sir. And he said, so I'm going to beat you with the cane 8 times for a week. And he did. And this is a guy who's an incredibly successful businessman. He runs a very big business in England. But he told me he has a CFO, a finance officer, who does all the figures for him because he's so nervous of mathematical sums from back then that he just can't look at a spreadsheet and things. He has to talk it through with his CFO to make decisions. So I'm saying that as a lifelong impact is so direct,
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting. In neuroscience, I think Dr. Bessel Vander, the psychiatrist, and The Body Keeps the Score talks about this idea when we go into freeze response, there's no activity in the brain. If we're in fear, it's not as if we're stupid. I used to have this. I couldn't think. If I was gone into that freeze, activity stops. And it's like, you mentioned your friend saying fear, or the colleague. It's like this is not a great opportunity to learn if we're in fear a lot of the time.
No. Fear and humiliation. So some of the ones I've spoken to have had really, I'd say, very unfulfilling lives by their own admission. Mm. And what I like about them is they're so English, and they go, well, I don't really want to make a fuss, but they were made to feel so insignificant, such failures as 8, 9, 10-year-olds, that they just assumed they were destined to fail. One of the people who I've talked to at length in this book was considered academically below average. And he and 2 others were put by Mr. Maud in the center of his classroom. And he referred to them as dunce central. And, that he said that was the end of his self-confidence, along with everything else, that you were just made to feel, as he said, unworthy every day. It's terrible to leave people with that legacy from a school that's meant to get the best out of you.
Thank you. I was very touched by that. I think I left boarding school, although similar to you, I was good at rugby and I was athletics captain, things like that. I left feeling like I was a failure, and my core belief was I'm a piece of shit, which really hampered me and kind of led to my breakdown working in London in the 90s. Just there's something wrong with me. And reading your book, it was like so many other people having similar beliefs.
And it's interesting how you're saying the body keeps the score, and it's so true. So the friend of mine who was raped aged 9, he sort of kept everything together in a rather sad, surviving but not flourishing way for a very long time. And he had a major breakdown, and they worked out afterwards, him and his therapist, that it was because his son had just turned 9. And he felt the danger that his son was in now, and it triggered in him this very extreme breakdown, actually.
Wow, thank you. Nick Duff talks about that quite a bit, about often when our children reach the age that we were sent off to boarding school, that does trigger because suddenly we realize how small they are.
Well, I have a daughter, because I still have a young daughter who's 11 and a half, and I look at her and realize that is the age at which I was sexually molested. And it's just unimaginable, really. And it makes me quite cross again.
Wow, yeah. Thank you. We've been doing a documentary and we did a retreat about a month ago, and listening to other people's stories similarly, I could just feel so much anger. It was, not just me reading your book, so many of us have been through similar things. So I'd love you to realize we're going from difficult subject to difficult subjects. I'd love for you to speak a little bit about bullying.
Mm,
You put a chapter in there. Yeah, I think I wrote down this, the yeah, Miles Corbett being the bully.
mm.
Yeah, you mentioned a chapter in the book about bullying. How was that?
It was really very scary. I mean, of course, bullying is designed to be, but everyone I spoke to who was that generation with me at Maidwell, when I mentioned the two names, I call them Corbett and Harrison here. But when I mentioned their real names to people, they still shuddered. You know, I'm talking about men in their late 50s and 60s who remember these. They were totally out of control. It was part of the school culture. I believe, I have no proof of this, that the more perverted and sadistic teachers enjoyed this substratum of nastiness being encouraged. And they were completely out of control, these two. Vicious, vicious bullies. And they couldn't have been more unpleasant or more physically threatening, more mentally scarring. Both horrible people. And they were so sure of their invulnerability, they even took on the junior master. And Mr. Fairfax, as I call him because he's still alive, had a sports car. And we all had sheath knives, a rather odd part of our life at this school was everyone carried a long blade. It was just part of the culture. And Mr. Fairfax was driving his sports car around a corner near the school when it went upside down into a ditch. And the police noted that his tires had been slashed. And it was by this pair of bullies. And Mr. Fairfax told me how the headmaster came to see him and said, well, look, how much is that car worth? And we're talking a very long time ago. And he said, well, it's £300. And so the headmaster, rather than deal with these bullies, you know, he could have expelled them. He could have had them more than expelled. They could have been up before the law. Quietly dealt with it so that each of the fathers paid Mr. Fairfax £150 so he could buy a new car. And these horrifying bullies stayed on at the school. I mean, it's astonishing. And I wonder what they had on him. I mean, were they in on the perversion that, sorry, not in on it, but did they understand enough of the perversion of the headmaster that they could have blackmailed him? Or one of them had a father who was quite a prominent figure in society. And I wonder if the headmaster, who was a terrible snob, didn't want to upset him or whatever it was. But they should have been removed at that point for sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles. Kind of moving on to the subject you talk about quite a bit towards the end of the book is that younger matron when you were 11. If you feel comfortable to
Mm,
talk about that.
yes.
Um,
Yes, this was the hardest bit of the book to write, and I think I left it till pretty much the end. So, yeah, halfway through a term, this is very unusual, but halfway through a term, I was promoted from a dormitory on the first floor of the school up to a pair of dormitories in the attics called the uppers. And they were rarely policed because they were right next to the assistant matron's bedroom. So it was assumed she would keep an eye on us. And unfortunately, this woman was sexually abusive. And I was one of her victims. And it's a difficult one because I actually write about it. You know, people think, oh, lucky you. Well, I think if I'd been 17 or 18 and a female member of staff had made these moves on me, then I probably would have thought that was fair. But I was 11 and she was, I think, 19 or 20. And if you reverse the genders on that and think of a 19 or 20-year-old man with an 11-year-old girl, you realize how wrong it is. And yeah, I mean, she was very, very seductive. I don't mean on a sexual level, because I didn't have any understanding of that, but just in terms of providing warmth and understanding in this chill landscape. She seemed so on my side and whispered and made it all lovely and brought me biscuits and grapes and then came back to molest me. And it was horribly confusing. I thought somehow we had tapped into something from the movies in terms of love or something, but of course that's part of the abuse. And she liked to really upend me and the other one she was abusing, and manipulate us emotionally. And I remember once she was going on to become a Wren, a member of the Royal Navy for Women, and I'm sure dishonestly she said, "Oh, I think I'm going to have to leave school earlier than planned." And we were so caught up in the web of her abuse that we were so traumatized that she was going to leave. And I remember cutting myself repeatedly because I thought I could do a deal with God that if I hurt myself enough, she'd be allowed by God to stay. And I remember my elation when she confirmed she was seeing out her full stint as assistant matron. One of the weirdest things about writing, the process of writing this book, because when I finished it, I decided to do something completely different because it had been so terrible for so long writing this book. And I pressed send to my publishers, and then I went up into the attics here at the house I live in, and I was helping shift some books from an old room, and there were some on a high shelf, and I pulled. I'm 6'4", so I pulled some of them down, and the ones other people couldn't reach. And then I found in my hand two books. One was the prayer book my father had given me as a parting gift in September 1972 for going to that school, which I found absolutely astonishing. I didn't know I still had it. But much more devastating was finding a small diary from 1976 and opening it. It's my little sort of child's diary, really. And in the flyleaf, my abuser had written her telephone number and address, and me, Emmy, referring to her. And it was, I nearly came off my feet, actually. And in fact, the person who was with me said, "Are you all right?" And I went, "Well, no, I'm not." And it was such a shock. It was too big a coincidence. It was just extraordinary, really, to be reconnected with her. That moment was beyond bizarre.
Thank you. Thank you for your courage in sharing these stories. I've heard from a few people who have really been touched by what you've written, and especially that instance. I can really, I can resonate, having had a similar experience happen at my school. So thank you
No.
for sharing. I mean, moving forward, I mean, you mentioned this a little bit in some of the articles that have been published about the future of boarding schools, about certainly opening a debate for the 8 to 13. I'd love to hear your opinion, having, heard so many stories from other people. What do you feel for us moving forward around boarding school?
Well, I mean, personally, I don't think children should board before the age of 13. I have 7 children, and none of them have been asked to board. 2 of them have weekly boarded from the age of 14 and 16 because they wanted to. And I respected their choice, although one of them regretted it. And I heard that immediately. But I cannot see how a child under 13 can possibly go away from home for his or her own safety, for his or her normal emotional development. And also, I don't think that they can possibly make that decision because they don't know what they're committing to. They may think they're going to Hogwarts, but they don't know what they're doing. And I've heard so many unbelievably bleak stories from people who went to these schools since starting this book. And then I can't go anywhere at the moment without people coming up. I'm not complaining, but coming up and sharing whispered conversations about how awful it was for them. And they all say, "I haven't told anyone." So I know of people who have publicly said how awful it was. But there's an enormous number of others who've, out of shame, wrongly placed shame, out of loyalty to parents who might still be alive, whatever the reason, that they suffered terribly. And I just think it's inhuman. I think one day we'll look back, hopefully before not too many years have passed, and think it's as outrageous as corporal punishment is for children. It's just not right. And look, there are even the most civilized societies, and Scandinavian, for instance, there are some boarding schools for special cases, for children who have needs that can be addressed in that way, whether they're family ones or whatever. So there will always be a place for institutions, but it shouldn't be considered normal to send your children away to live with strangers.
Thank you. Yeah, I so agree. And, I went age 11. I know many who went, again, I have a bookshelf here. Bear Grylls went age 8, David Cameron age 7, Richard Branson age 7, John Peel, Tony Blair. I mean, what do you feel, kind of looking at our leaders who have been to these institutions, how do you feel that impacts us as a nation, but also decision making?
Yeah, I went at 8, so I know the lower end of things. I would say it would be very hard to come out of as emotionally cauterizing an experience as being sent away at a young age away from your home without having emotional and psychological scars. Of course, there have always been benevolent head teachers and nicer environments among the boarding schools. But the ones who had a tough time they must still feel the weight of that on them. So I suppose as a general point, I'd be nervous about people who've been so badly hurt psychologically making healthy choices for society.
Thank you, Charles. Yes, I think Nick Duff quotes Professor Antonio Damasio, who says that we can't make good decisions without emotional information. And I notice in your book you talk about that quite a bit, about how we're emotionally cauterized or
Mm.
suppressing or pushing, or you mentioned about blubbing.
Yes.
Mm,
Yes. I mean, amazing, really, that so the headmaster who took over at Maidwell after the one who was there with me, I saw in fact, you're in it, a documentary on BBC called The Making of Them.
mm, mm,
And the cavalier attitude towards young children's emotions. There's one moment where this man, Mr. Paul was his name, John Paul, he's dead. But he says, well, I find it very hard to think of cases where a boy hasn't got used to the situation by the age of 10 or 11, but they're arriving at the age of 7 or 8. So he's just writing off their emotional well-being between the ages of 7 and 8 and 10 or 11 as irrelevant. But they're obviously not. It's insane to think like that. Get used to. Doesn't mean they like it even at that stage, but get used to it. Well, yes, you get used to losing a leg or an arm, I'm sure, but it doesn't mean you embrace it or that you think it's a good thing. And I hate these. Let's face it, someone like him is looking to fill his school to make money for his career and his business. And so they're not on the same wavelength as the best interests of the child at all.
Yeah, thank you. What comes to me is, the more I do research around boarding school syndrome and trauma, is around neglect. I think the
Yes.
NPCC says neglect is the ongoing failure to meet a child's basic needs and the most common form of child abuse. And as I read your book, it's like Granny Four just, letting you go to bed, and, you being sick. And it's like not understanding what's the psychology of what's happening to this little boy. So, yeah,
Mm.
I really,
Yeah, I had what I assume was bulimia at the school from the age of 9. I wasn't diagnosed as such, so I can't categorically state that, but all the symptoms are there. I'd make myself sick repeatedly, many, many times. I mean, hundreds of times probably, and present this pathetic offering of vomit in the morning, trying to get this cold witch of a matron to show me some female attention. And she was incapable of it. So it's not her fault, but it was very damaging, I think, to me emotionally to do something as extreme as that and still be ignored was very emotionally crippling, I think.
mm. How did you, I found it fascinating you talking about the Hoffman process.
Mm,
When I was having my breakdown, it was about 2002, 2001, I looked at doing the Hoffman process. I ended up going in a Buddhist monastery. That was my journey. But I'd love for you to share a bit of your healing journey. How,
Mm,
you know, you came across, this trauma and how you've gone about healing.
mm. Well, I'm going to be respectful about Hoffman because a lot of what they do is secret for a good reason.
Mm, mm,
Because anyone listening to this who then did Hoffman would get less out of it because they'd know what was coming. But essentially, what happened, I was 42 and I had come to a second divorce and I was feeling bereft. And people were saying, God, you're such a screw up and all that sort of thing. And I thought, yeah, I am. So I packed myself off to a clinic in London, thinking I had some addiction or problem of that nature. And I was seen by a leading clinician there who said, no, he made me tell him everything. And then he just said, look, you haven't got any addictive problems. You just have what we call an effed up childhood. And I was walking away from there, and a friend of mine from America rang just out of the blue and said, what are you up to? And I explained. And then she said, oh, you should try Hoffman. And within a few days, I was in California doing the Hoffman process with 24 others. I found actually, interestingly, very high IQ among those people there. Just, I don't know if that was because they were in high achieving jobs and could afford it or whatever, but that was very noticeable. And it's really a look at your childhood and stripping away blame towards others, which is very healthy, I think, and dealing with the reality of the impact that it's left you with, and then finding tools with which to cope in the future. So I went there, I obeyed it rigidly. It's only, I think it's about 8 days or something, but it's very intensive. My days, because I was dealing not just with parents, but step parents as well, and the headmaster, weirdly, who I had this shocking news with my surrogate father. And so I was dealing with 5 adults to process as part of this. And so my days could be, 14 hours long or something. And it's like doing an enormous amount of, somebody told me it's like doing 2 years of intensive therapy, just doing those 8 days.
wow.
And I found it very helpful. I had a great friend just go there the other day and I was really encouraging. It's not the answer for life, but it's a good step forward, I'd say. And I still do all sorts of other things. But I found it an interesting way, and it did unburden. See, one of the reasons I've been in all my interviews, I've made it very clear I don't blame my parents, and I think I can put that down to Hoffman, because you come to appreciate your parents were dealt their own hand of cards, and you just have to let it go. I don't believe most parents set out to do wrong.
Thank you. Thank you. And some of the other tools you've talked about in interviews, EMDR, therapy, and I love that you've explored so many of these different modalities. I think it's very inspiring.
Yes. So today I was doing Tai Chi. I find that really helpful. EMDR I do weekly, and I won't do it forever. A good thing about EMDR, it's for us, it's not forever. It's a set session period, really, or session number. And therapy generally, yes. Meditation. I'm not very good at meditation, but I find Tai Chi takes me into a meditative place. And I hardly ever touch alcohol. Like a lot of people who went to boarding school, I think I was relying on it as an anesthetic, not in a alcoholic way, but in a emotional support way. And I don't think that's remotely helpful. So it's what works for you, I think, and it's a matter of embracing all sorts of things. The Tai Chi I do is quite an explosive one. It's not, I think if people think of Tai Chi, they think of driving past groups of quite elderly people in the park doing small movements, which is wonderful. It's very good for you. Mine's more of a martial art. I mean, they're all martial art, but mine's more of a dynamic way of doing it. and that suits my personality a bit more, I think.
Thank you. What form do you do? I got very much into Qigong, and I also got it.
Yes, I do some of that.
Mm.
Um, it's an academy with a particular name. It's quite small, but I'd rather not say if that's all
Oh,
right.
of course. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's no worries. Yeah, I got very much into Qigong.
Yes.
Um, I think it was Chen Manqing Tai Chi for a while. And
Mm.
also Falun Gong. I did Falun Gong for a
Oh, did you? Yes.
number of years. One of the monks in the monastery I lived in, he was a medical doctor who was having, time as a monk, and he used to. When I first arrived in the monastery, he was doing Falun Gong out in front of the monastery, and so he taught me it, and I did it every day for a few years. So yeah,
Fantastic.
yeah. I mean, how's people's response been to the book? In the book, you write about, some people sidling up to your wife and saying class traitor. How
Mm.
has it been now the book's come out? How have people responded?
I've been overwhelmed by the kindness of people. Honestly, I can't believe how lovely the public are understanding this. I think to people who haven't been to boarding school, it's so shocking. One of my friends who went to a less unpleasant boarding school, he said to me, "God, I thought you'd be protected." And there's an assumption that because I come from a very privileged background, of course, and all that, that these things can't happen to you. But of course, they can happen to any child who's left in such a vulnerable state with very bad strangers in charge of their life. So people have been very empathetic, very kind. Um, Sorry, that's my watch talking to me. And essentially, I think I'd assumed there'd be people saying, "Well, poor little rich boy, grow up," but it hasn't been like that actually.
Thank you. Thank you. Just as we start to wrap up the interview, I know I put down loads of other questions. I created another sheet of notes, um, but I think we've gone through most of them. Are there any final things you'd like to say to my audience?
Well, I think it's we're lucky to live in a world today where people take this seriously. I think even 20 years ago, people would just tell you to shut up and get on with it, but not now. And that's proven by the reaction to my book at the moment. I mean, people are incredibly gentle about it. And it's very interesting. People said, "Oh, you're so brave to bring it up." It's not. It's absolutely nothing to do with bravery. It's really not, and it's to do with just. I think we all have a duty to tell the truth, and whatever the background of our story is, to share things that have gone very wrong is very healthy. I think my main thing to anyone listening to this who's bottled it up, which is a lot of people, is I can't tell individuals my advice, but I have seen huge advantage to people who have finally unburdened themselves and told their spouse or their best friend or found a therapist or whatever. It's been incredible. I mean, one of my friends, when this started, he hadn't told anyone, and he had terminal cancer. And he's spoken to me. He has a lightness about him. His cancer's in full remission. And
Wow.
he said to me right at the beginning, "I know I've got this cancer because of what I went through at Maidwell." And I'm not saying that talking to me has had any effect, but I think he's now spoken to his wife, who understands him that much better. I do think this is a very serious, damaging burden to carry alone. And if you feel you can share it with somebody else, you might be very happily surprised by the effects on you and on the burden you've been carrying.
Mm, well, thank you. Thank you. I think you sharing your story has been very inspiring, and um, having written my own story, I know how difficult it was for me. And so thank you for persevering and putting it out there. So yeah, thank you, Charles.
Thank you, Piers.